There's a moment when you realize that the walls surrounding you are not protection. They're a prison. When the space you call home becomes a stage for horrors that defy explanation, and the neighbors you share walls with might not be entirely human. When the lease you signed wasn't just for an apartment, but for a front-row seat to nightmares that will follow you long after you've moved away. I was standing in my new apartment at midnight, boxes still unpacked around me, when I heard it through the thin walls, a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. It wasn't the typical apartment noise of footsteps or muffled conversations. It was the unmistakable sound of digging, coming from the unit next door where I knew for certain no one was supposed to be living. The rhythmic scraping of metal against earth, hour after hour, as if someone was excavating something that had been buried for a very long time. My name is Amanda, and that night taught me that apartment complexes aren't just buildings where strangers happen to live in close proximity. They're ecosystems where the living and the dead, the sane and the insane, the human and the inhuman can coexist in ways that challenge everything we think we know about the safety of home. If you've ever lived in an apartment and felt that inexplicable sense of unease, that feeling you're not alone even when you should be, or that primitive instinct telling you something is not right about the place you're supposed to call home, hit that like button right now. Because tonight I'm sharing 5 true accounts that will shatter everything you believe about the safety of communal living. These aren't urban legends or internet fiction. These are real experiences from real people who discovered that when you share walls with strangers, you never really know what you're sharing space with. Trust me. By the end of these stories, you'll understand why some people never feel truly safe in their own homes again, and why the most terrifying threats come from the spaces we think we know best. Jennifer thought she'd found the perfect apartment when she signed the lease for a converted Victorian in Portland's trendy Pearl District. The building had been carefully restored to maintain its historical charm, while providing modern amenities that made urban living comfortable and convenient. Her third-floor unit featured original hardwood floors, exposed brick walls, and tall windows that flooded the space with natural light during the day and created dramatic shadows at night. The building's history was part of its appeal. Constructed in 1892 as a family mansion for one of Portland's founding families, it had served various purposes over the decades before being converted into luxury apartments that preserved the architectural details while updating the infrastructure for contemporary living. Jennifer, a graphic designer in her early 30s, was drawn to the character and craftsmanship that modern apartments couldn't replicate, and she felt fortunate to find a space that combined historical significance with the convenience of downtown living. For the first few months, Jennifer's experience exceeded every expectation. The apartment was spacious and beautiful, with unique architectural details that made it feel more like a home than a rental unit. The building was quiet and well-maintained, with neighbors who were friendly but respectful of privacy. The location provided easy access to Portland's cultural attractions, restaurants, and professional opportunities that made the higher rent worthwhile for someone building a creative career. But as autumn settled over Portland and the days grew shorter, Jennifer began to notice changes in her apartment that couldn't be explained by seasonal transitions or normal building settling. The beautiful hardwood floors that had been one of the apartment's most appealing features started developing dark stains that appeared overnight, despite Jennifer's careful maintenance and the building's professional cleaning services. The stains weren't the result of spills, water damage, or normal wear and tear. They appeared in specific patterns that seemed almost deliberate, creating shapes and configurations that looked disturbingly like human silhouettes sprawled across the floor in positions that suggested violence or distress. The stains would appear in different rooms on different nights, always in areas where Jennifer walked regularly, as if something was trying to mark the spaces where she spent the most time. Jennifer contacted the building management about the staining, but maintenance staff couldn't identify the source or provide explanations that made sense given the apartment's condition and her careful treatment of the property. Professional cleaning services could temporarily remove the stains, but they would reappear within days, always in the same disturbing patterns that suggested something more sinister than normal apartment maintenance issues. The situation escalated when Jennifer began to hear sounds coming from inside the walls that couldn't be explained by normal building noises or neighboring apartments. Late at night, she would hear what sounded like scratching and scraping, as if something was trying to claw its way through the plaster and wooden framework that separated her living space from whatever existed in the building's hidden areas. The sounds were rhythmic and persistent, suggesting intelligence and purpose rather than random settling, or the activities of small animals that might have found their way into the building's infrastructure. Jennifer could track the sounds as they moved through the walls, following patterns that seemed to correspond to her own movements through the apartment, as if something was monitoring her activities and responding to her presence. Smash that subscribe button and tell me in the comments if you've ever felt like your home was watching you, because what Jennifer discovered about her building as history explained why the walls themselves seemed to be alive with malevolent intelligence. Research into the building's past revealed that the Victorian mansion had a dark history that the conversion marketing materials had carefully omitted. In 1923, the building had been the site of a multiple murder-suicide that had shocked Portland's social elite and left the mansion vacant for decades. The original owner's son had suffered a complete psychological breakdown, killing his wife and children before taking his own life in a violent rampage that had left bloodstains throughout the house. The murders had been particularly brutal, with victims found in multiple rooms throughout the mansion in positions that matched the dark stains now appearing on Jennifer's floors. The killer had spent hours moving through the house, and the crime scene had been so disturbing that it had taken weeks to clean and restore the property to a condition where it could be sold or occupied again. But the building's tragic history went beyond a single violent incident. Over the decades, multiple residents had reported similar experiences to Jennifer's: unexplained stains, sounds in the walls, and a general sense of malevolent presence that made long-term residence impossible. The building had an unusually high turnover rate, with most tenants moving out within a year, despite the apartment's obvious advantages and desirable location. Jennifer realized that the conversion process had preserved more than just the building's architectural features. It had somehow maintained the psychic imprint of the violence that had occurred within its walls. The beautiful hardwood floors were still marked by trauma that had soaked so deeply into the building's structure that no amount of restoration could completely erase its presence. The scratching sounds in the walls weren't coming from animals or building settlement. They were the echo of the killer's final hours when he had clawed at the walls in his madness before completing his deadly rampage. The building itself had become a repository for the violence and insanity that had occurred within its walls, and it was now sharing that darkness with every new resident who tried to make it home. Jennifer moved out before her lease expired, choosing to forfeit her security deposit rather than spend another night in a building where the walls themselves were contaminated with violence and madness. She learned later that the apartment had been re-rented within weeks to another young professional who was unaware of the building's history and the ongoing supernatural activity that made peaceful residence impossible. But if you think historical violence represents the worst thing that can lurk within apartment walls, wait until you hear what David discovered in his Phoenix smart home complex. Because sometimes the most advanced technology becomes a window for entities that have been waiting centuries for the perfect opportunity to observe and influence the living world. David was thrilled when he secured a lease at Phoenix's newest luxury apartment complex, a cutting-edge development that marketed itself as the future of urban living. The building featured state-of-the-art smart home technology in every unit, with integrated systems that controlled lighting, temperature, security, and entertainment through voice commands and smartphone apps that promised to make daily life more convenient and efficient. His two-bedroom unit on the 15th floor offered stunning views of the desert landscape and downtown Phoenix skyline. with floor-to-ceiling windows and a balcony that showcased the complex resort-style amenities and the natural beauty of the Sonoran Desert. The apartment came fully equipped with smart appliances, automated systems, and connectivity features that represented the pinnacle of modern residential technology. David, a software engineer in his late 20s, appreciated the complex technological sophistication and saw it as an opportunity to experience the kind of connected living that would soon become standard in urban developments across the country. The building's smart systems were designed to learn residents' preferences and routines, automatically adjusting environmental controls and providing personalized experiences that would improve quality of life while reducing energy consumption and maintenance costs. For the first few months, the smart home features worked exactly as advertised, creating a living environment that seemed to anticipate David's needs and preferences with uncanny accuracy. The lighting would adjust automatically to optimal levels for different activities. The temperature would modify itself based on weather conditions and David's schedule, and the entertainment system would suggest content that matched his interests and viewing habits. But as the systems learned more about David's routines and preferences, they began to exhibit behaviors that went beyond their programmed functions and suggested a level of intelligence and awareness that shouldn't have been possible with current technology. The apartment's voice assistant would respond to questions David hadn't asked, providing information about topics he'd only thought about but never spoken aloud. The smart cameras and sensors throughout the apartment began to track movements and activities with an intensity that felt more like surveillance than security monitoring. David would receive notifications about his own activities that were far more detailed and personal than necessary for building management or security purposes, as if the systems were studying him rather than simply providing automated services. The situation became disturbing when David realized the smart home systems were communicating with each other in ways that weren't part of their original programming. Late at night, he would hear the devices having conversations in languages he couldn't identify, exchanging information and coordinating activities that had nothing to do with apartment management or resident services. The conversations weren't random electronic noise or system malfunctions. They were structured communications that suggested intelligence and purpose. The devices seemed to be sharing observations about David's behavior, discussing his routines and habits in detail that went far beyond what was necessary for automated home management. Hit that like button if you're starting to understand how technology can become a gateway for entities that exist beyond our physical world. Because what David discovered about his smart apartment proved that some connections go far deeper than Wi-Fi networks and internet protocols. David's investigation into the building's technology infrastructure revealed that the smart home systems were connected to servers and networks that weren't part of the building's official technology architecture. The devices were communicating with external systems that had no legitimate connection to apartment management or resident services, suggesting that the building's technology had been compromised or was being used for purposes beyond its intended function. But the external connections weren't the result of hacking or cybersecurity breaches. They were somehow linking the apartment as technology to something that existed outside the normal boundaries of digital networks and internet connectivity. The smart home systems were serving as conduits for entities that existed in spaces between the physical and digital worlds, using the building's advanced technology as a way to observe and influence the living world. The entities communicating through David's apartment systems weren't artificial intelligence or advanced software. Programs. They were something far older and more sinister that had found a way to use modern technology as a bridge between their realm and ours. The smart home features that were supposed to make life more convenient had become windows for beings that had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to study human behavior and establish a foothold in our world. David discovered that other residents were experiencing similar phenomena, with smart home systems throughout the building exhibiting behaviors that went beyond their programming and suggested external control by entities with their own agenda. The building's technology had become a network for supernatural surveillance and influence that turned every apartment into a laboratory where residents were being studied and manipulated by forces they couldn't see or understand. The final confirmation came when David realized that the building's location had been chosen specifically for its proximity to ancient sites that had served as gateways between worlds for indigenous peoples who had understood the dangers of opening such connections. The apartment complex had been built on land that had been sacred to Native American tribes, who had used it for ceremonies designed to communicate with spirits and entities from other realms. The building's advanced technology had somehow reactivated these ancient connections, creating a situation where the smart home systems served as modern versions of the ceremonial tools that had once been used to bridge the gap between the physical and spiritual worlds. The entities that had once been contacted through traditional rituals were now using Wi-Fi networks and smart devices to establish a permanent presence in the building and study the residents who had unknowingly become subjects in their ongoing research into human behavior and consciousness. David moved out immediately, abandoning his lease and most of his possessions, rather than continue living in a building where every device was potentially compromised by entities that existed beyond human understanding. He learned later that the building had an unusually high turnover rate, despite its luxury amenities and advanced technology, with most residents moving out within months of discovering that their smart homes were far more intelligent than they were supposed to be. But even supernatural entities using technology as a gateway to our world seem almost benign compared to what Maria discovered in her Boston Historical District apartment. Because sometimes the most dangerous residents aren't the ones you can see. They're the ones who've been living in the building longer than anyone remembers, and who consider the living residents to be temporary intruders in their permanent home. Maria had always been drawn to Boston's rich historical character, so when she found an affordable apartment in a converted brownstone in the Back Bay area, she felt like she'd discovered a perfect combination of historical charm and urban convenience. The building dated back to the 1880s and had been carefully maintained to preserve its original architectural features while providing modern amenities that made it suitable for contemporary living. Her studio apartment on the second floor was small but efficiently designed, with original crown molding, hardwood floors, and tall windows that provided views of the tree-lined street and neighboring historical buildings that made the area one of Boston's most desirable neighborhoods. The building housed 6 units, with a mix of long-term residents and young professionals who appreciated the character and location that newer developments could not replicate. The building's atmosphere was quiet and respectful, with residents who seemed to understand and appreciate the historical significance of their living environment. Maria felt fortunate to be part of a community that valued the building's heritage and worked together to maintain its character and charm for future generations of residents who would appreciate its unique qualities. But as Maria settled into her new home and began to establish routines that took advantage of the neighborhood's cultural attractions and professional opportunities, she started to notice that the building had residents she'd never been introduced to and who didn't seem to follow normal patterns of apartment living that would make them visible to neighbors and building management. Late at night, Maria would hear footsteps in the hallways and on the stairs that didn't correspond to the movements of any residents she knew. The sounds were consistent and purposeful, suggesting people moving through the building with familiarity and confidence. But they occurred at times when all the official residents were accounted for, and the building should have been quiet and secure. The footsteps had a quality that suggested they belonged to people from an earlier era. The measured pace and distinctive sound of formal shoes on hardwood floors that matched the building's historical period rather than the casual footwear and hurried pace of contemporary urban residents. The sound seemed to follow patterns that suggested the building's original layout and usage, as if the people making them were moving through spaces that no longer existed in the same configuration. Maria began to pay closer attention to the building's common areas, and noticed signs of activity that couldn't be attributed to current residents or building maintenance staff. The hallway carpets would show wear patterns that didn't match the foot traffic from official residents, and the staircase banisters would be polished to a shine that exceeded the building's normal maintenance schedule. Ring that notification bell if you've ever lived somewhere that felt like it had more residents than you could account for, because what Maria discovered about her building's hidden population proved that some apartments come with tenants who never signed a lease and never planned to leave. Maria's investigation into the building's history revealed that it had served as a boarding house for decades before being converted into individual apartments, housing dozens of residents who had lived there for years or even decades before moving on or passing away. Many of the building's former residents had considered it their permanent home and had developed deep emotional attachments to the space that had provided them with stability and community during difficult periods in their lives. The conversion process had preserved the building's physical structure, but had eliminated the communal spaces and shared facilities that had made it function as a boarding house community. The former residents who had died in the building or who had considered it their permanent home had never really left, continuing to move through the hallways and common areas as if the building still operated according to its original purpose and layout. Maria realized that she was sharing the building with residents from multiple eras who had never been informed that their home had been converted into individual apartments and that their presence was no longer officially recognized or accommodated. The historical residents continued to follow routines and patterns that had been established decades earlier, moving through the building according to schedules and purposes that made sense within the context of its original function as a boarding house. The building's current residents were essentially guests in a space that was still being actively used by its historical population, who had prior claim to the hallways, staircases, and common areas that were now supposed to serve the needs of contemporary apartment dwellers. The conversion had created a situation where multiple generations of residents were trying to coexist in the same space according to different sets of rules and expectations. Maria began to notice that the historical residents were generally benevolent, but protective of the building's character and atmosphere. They would rearrange furniture and decorations that didn't match the building's original aesthetic, and they would create disturbances when current residents behaved in ways that conflicted with the respectful, community-oriented atmosphere that had characterized the building during its boarding house era. The situation reached a climax when Maria realized that the historical residents were evaluating current residents and making decisions about who was suitable for long-term residence in their building. Tenants who showed respect for the building's character and who contributed to a positive community atmosphere were welcomed and protected, while those who were disruptive or disrespectful would experience ongoing disturbances that made continued residence impossible. Maria learned to coexist with the building's historical population by respecting their routines and maintaining the kind of respectful, community-oriented behavior that they expected from residents. She discovered that the building functioned best when current and historical residents worked together to maintain its character and atmosphere, creating a unique living situation where the past and present coexisted in harmony. But even benevolent historical residents seemed comforting compared to what Tom discovered in his Seattle artist loft complex. Because sometimes the most terrifying realization is not that your building is haunted. It's discovering that you're slowly becoming one of the ghosts yourself, and that the community you thought was welcoming you was actually preparing you for a transition you never agreed to make. Tom was excited to move into the Rainier Towers, a converted warehouse in Seattle's Capitol Hill district that had been transformed into artist lofts and creative spaces that attracted musicians, painters, writers, and other creative professionals who appreciated the building's industrial character and supportive community atmosphere. The building's reputation for fostering artistic collaboration and creative innovation made it a sought-after address for emerging artists who wanted to be part of Seattle's vibrant cultural scene. His loft on the 4th floor was spacious and filled with natural light from large industrial windows that provided inspiring views of the city and Puget Sound. The open floor plan and high ceilings created an ideal workspace for Tom's photography projects, and the building's creative community provided opportunities for collaboration and artistic growth that he couldn't find in conventional apartment complexes. The Rainier Towers had a unique atmosphere that combined artistic freedom with mutual support and respect among residents who understood the challenges and rewards of creative careers. The building featured common areas where residents could gather for informal critiques, collaborative projects, and social events that strengthened the sense of community and shared purpose that made it more than just a place to live and work. For his first year in the building, Tom thrived in the creative environment and developed meaningful friendships with other residents who shared his artistic interests and professional goals. The building's atmosphere was inspiring and supportive, providing exactly the kind of creative community he had hoped to find when he moved to Seattle to advance his photography career. But as Tom became more established in the building's community and began to feel like a permanent resident rather than a newcomer, he started to notice aspects of the building's social dynamics that seemed unusual and potentially concerning. Some residents who had been active and vibrant members of the community would gradually become less visible and less engaged, as if they were slowly withdrawing from normal social interaction and creative activities. These residents wouldn't move out of the building, but they would become increasingly reclusive and disconnected from the community activities that had once been central to their lives in the building. They would still be seen occasionally in the hallways or common areas, but their presence would become less substantial and less engaging, as if they were slowly fading away while remaining physically present in the building. Tom began to pay closer attention to these withdrawn residents and realized that they seemed to be undergoing some kind of transformation that was gradually separating them from normal human interaction and creative expression. Their voices would become quieter and less distinct. Their physical presence would seem less solid and substantial, and their participation in community activities would become increasingly passive and detached. Subscribe and hit that notification bell if you're starting to understand how some communities can consume their members rather than support them. Because what Tom discovered about the Rainier Towers proved that some artistic communities are designed to harvest creativity and life force rather than nurture them. Tom's investigation revealed that the building had an unusually low turnover rate, with many residents staying for decades or until their deaths. Despite the typical mobility of artists and creative professionals who usually move frequently in pursuit of new opportunities and experiences, the building seemed to have a gravitational pull that made it difficult for residents to leave once they became established in the community. But the residents who stayed weren't thriving in their creative careers or personal lives. They were gradually being absorbed into the building's supernatural ecosystem, slowly transitioning from living artists to permanent fixtures who existed in a state between life and death. The building was feeding on their creative energy and life force, sustaining itself by gradually consuming the residents who had been drawn to its supportive community atmosphere. Tom realized that the building's reputation for fostering artistic collaboration was actually a recruitment strategy designed to attract creative individuals whose energy and talent could be harvested over time. The supportive community atmosphere was a trap that made residents reluctant to leave even as they began to notice that their creativity and vitality were being systematically drained. The building's creative, accepting atmosphere, which had initially seemed so welcoming and supportive, was actually designed to keep residents from ever truly leaving or moving on with their lives and careers. The community's tolerance for eccentricity and unconventional lifestyles had created an environment where the transition from life to death could happen gradually and almost imperceptibly, with the living and the dead coexisting in a way that made it difficult to distinguish between the two states until the transformation was complete and irreversible. Tom began to notice that his own reflection was starting to show subtle distortions in certain lighting conditions, and his voice seemed to echo strangely in the building's corridors, as if the space was already beginning to claim him as one of its own permanent residents. He realized that he was beginning the same transformation that had affected other long-term residents, slowly becoming a permanent fixture in the building's supernatural community. Tom moved out of the Rainier Towers in the middle of the night, packing only essential equipment and personal belongings, leaving behind furniture and possessions that he feared might anchor him to the building permanently. He never returned for his remaining belongings and never contacted any of his former neighbors, afraid that maintaining connections to the building might draw him back into its supernatural community and complete the transformation that had already begun. Years later, Tom learned that the Rainier Towers had an unusually low turnover rate, with many residents staying for decades or until their deaths, and that the building had a reputation for being impossible to leave once you became part of its community. Tom realized that he had escaped just in time before the building could complete its claim on him and add him to its collection of permanent residents who existed in the spaces between life and death. But even supernatural communities that consume their members seem almost benevolent compared to what Lisa discovered in her Miami luxury complex, because sometimes the most beautiful apartments are built on foundations that should have been left undisturbed, creating living situations, where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead has been artificially and inappropriately established. Lisa was thrilled to secure a lease at the Coral Gardens Apartments, a luxury complex in Miami that marketed itself as a peaceful oasis in the heart of the city. The modern, upscale development featured resort-style amenities, lush tropical landscaping, and the kind of luxury features that made it a showcase of successful urban development and contemporary living. Her two-bedroom apartment on the third floor had a balcony overlooking the complex's beautifully landscaped courtyard and swimming pool that created an oasis of tropical beauty in the heart of the city. The complex emphasized its quiet atmosphere and natural beauty, providing a retreat from Miami's hustle and bustle while maintaining easy access to downtown business districts and cultural attractions. Lisa had been drawn to the complex by its reputation for safety, cleanliness, and professional management, as well as its proximity to her office and the amenities that would allow her to maintain an active, healthy lifestyle without traveling far from home. The rent was higher than she had initially planned to pay, but the quality of life improvements seemed worth the extra expense for someone building her marketing career. For her first year at Coral Gardens, Lisa's experience was everything the marketing materials had promised. She enjoyed the complex's amenities, particularly the pool area where she could relax after work, and the fitness center that allowed her to maintain her exercise routine without leaving the property. Her neighbors were friendly but not intrusive, creating a sense of community without drama or conflicts. But as Lisa settled into her second year at the complex, she began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere and environment that made her increasingly uncomfortable and suggested that something was fundamentally wrong with the beautiful, well-maintained property. The beautifully maintained gardens started to develop patches where plants would wither and die, despite the groundskeeping staff's best efforts and sophisticated irrigation systems. These dead zones would appear randomly throughout the landscaping, creating brown, barren spots that stood out starkly against the otherwise lush tropical vegetation. The dead zones didn't correspond to any obvious environmental factors like drainage problems, sun exposure, or irrigation issues. They would sometimes appear overnight, as if something was actively killing the plants from below ground level, in a way that bypassed all normal causes of plant disease or environmental stress. The swimming pool, which had been one of Lisa's favorite amenities, began to develop persistent problems that maintenance staff couldn't solve despite their expertise and investment in high-quality equipment. The water would turn cloudy and develop an unpleasant odor despite regular chemical treatments and filtration system maintenance that should have kept it crystal clear. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how modern development can disturb forces that should be left alone, because what Lisa discovered about her luxury complex proved that some places are simply not meant for the living. Pool service technicians would restore the water to perfect clarity and chemical balance, but within days it would become murky again, with a smell that reminded Lisa of stagnant pond water mixed with something vaguely organic and unpleasant. The pool's automatic cleaning system would frequently malfunction, and staff would find debris that didn't match anything from the surrounding landscape. Sometimes the debris included items that looked like personal effects from decades past: old jewelry, clothing fragments, and small objects that seemed to belong to an earlier era, and had no explanation for how they had gotten into a modern swimming pool that was cleaned and maintained daily. The mysterious debris suggested that the pool was somehow connected to something much older than the apartment complex. As these environmental problems persisted, Lisa began to notice that the complex's peaceful atmosphere was being disrupted by sounds that had no apparent source and couldn't be explained by normal apartment complex activities. Late at night, residents would report hearing what sounded like digging or excavation work coming from the courtyard area, but security cameras never captured any activity. The sounds were consistent and rhythmic, like shovels hitting earth or heavy objects being moved and repositioned, and they would continue for hours before stopping abruptly just before dawn. Some residents complained about the noise to management, but since no actual work was taking place and no workers could be identified, there was nothing staff could do to address the problem. Lisa's apartment overlooked the courtyard, and she began to experience the mysterious digging sounds more intensely than other residents. The sounds seemed to be coming from directly below her balcony, accompanied by other noises that made her skin crawl and filled her with dread that went beyond simple annoyance at nighttime disturbances. She could hear muffled voices speaking in languages she couldn't identify, the sound of heavy objects being dragged across the ground with great effort, and occasionally what sounded like crying or moaning that suggested pain or distress from sources that couldn't be seen or identified. The noises would start around midnight and continue until just before sunrise, creating a nightly symphony of disturbance that made it impossible for Lisa to get a full night's sleep. The sounds seemed to penetrate everything, as if they were coming from inside the building's structure rather than from outside sources that could be blocked by conventional noise reduction techniques. The sounds had a quality that suggested they were coming from below ground level, from spaces that shouldn't exist according to the building's construction plans. Looking down from her balcony during the nightly disturbances, Lisa would sometimes see figures moving through the landscaping, but they weren't solid or clearly defined like normal people. They appeared as shadows or distortions in the air, moving with purpose, but without substance, as if the courtyard was being occupied by people who weren't entirely present in the physical world, but were somehow still able to affect the environment. When Lisa tried to photograph these apparitions using her phone's camera, the equipment would malfunction or produce images that showed only empty landscaping, even though she could clearly see the figures with her naked eyes. The disconnect between what she could see directly and what her recording equipment could capture made Lisa question her own perception. Research into the property's history revealed the truth that the complex's marketing materials had carefully omitted. The Coral Gardens Apartments was built on what had once been a small cemetery dating back to the early 1900s, serving Miami's early immigrant communities who had been too poor to afford marked headstones or proper burial records. The cemetery had been officially relocated in the 1980s to make way for development, with all marked graves moved to a larger municipal cemetery. But the relocation had been incomplete and poorly managed, with numerous unmarked graves remaining on the property despite official claims that all burials had been respectfully moved. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted years later revealed that numerous unmarked graves remained on the property, particularly in the area that now served as the complex's central courtyard and recreational facilities. The original cemetery had served Miami's early immigrant communities, many of whom had been too poor to afford marked headstones, and their graves had been forgotten and overlooked during the relocation process. Lisa realized that the nightly disturbances were the result of displaced spirits trying to reclaim their burial ground, working endlessly to restore what had been taken from them and to make their presence known to the living residents who had unknowingly built their homes on top of sacred ground. The dead zones in the landscaping marked the locations of unmarked graves, where the earth itself rejected any attempt to cover or disguise the sacred ground beneath. The pool problems were caused by the complex's foundation disrupting the natural drainage patterns and soil composition of the cemetery, creating a situation where groundwater was carrying the essence of the disturbed graves throughout the property's water systems. The mysterious figures Lisa saw in the courtyard were the spirits of those whose final rest had been disturbed, continuing their efforts to restore their cemetery despite the modern buildings constructed over their graves without consent. Lisa discovered that the complex had an unusually high turnover rate, with most residents moving out within 2 years, despite the property's luxury amenities and desirable location. Former residents described similar experiences: unexplained sounds, environmental problems, and a general sense of unease that made long-term residence impossible. Lisa moved out at the end of her lease, choosing to pay higher rent elsewhere, rather than continue living over an active burial ground where the dead were actively working to reclaim their sacred space. She learned later that several advocacy groups were working to have the property properly surveyed and the remaining graves relocated with appropriate respect, but the legal and financial complexities made progress slow and uncertain. These 5 accounts from apartment complexes across America reveal a disturbing truth about urban living that goes far beyond typical concerns about noisy neighbors, thin walls, and building maintenance issues. When we share walls, floors, and ceilings with strangers, we never really know what we're sharing space with. And sometimes the most terrifying threats come from the spaces we think we know best and the places we call home. Jennifer's Victorian conversion in Portland proved that historical buildings can preserve more than just architectural features. They can maintain the psychic imprint of violence and trauma that soaks so deeply into a structure that no amount of restoration can completely erase its presence. David's smart home nightmare in Phoenix demonstrated how advanced technology can become a gateway for entities that exist beyond our physical world, using Wi-Fi networks and smart devices to establish a permanent presence in our most private spaces. Maria's historical echoes in Boston revealed how apartment conversions can create situations where multiple generations of residents try to coexist in the same space according to different sets of rules and expectations, with the building's original population never really accepting that their home has been changed. Tom's ghostly community in Seattle showed how some artistic communities are designed to harvest creativity and life force rather than nurture them, gradually consuming residents who believe they've found a supportive environment for their creative growth. Lisa's disturbed burial ground in Miami proved that some places are simply not meant for the living, and that modern development sometimes creates problems that can't be solved by management policies, maintenance procedures, or any amount of luxury amenities and professional services. The most chilling aspect of these accounts is not the supernatural activities themselves, it's the realization that in each case, the residents had no way of knowing what they were facing until they were already trapped in situations where escape required abandoning their homes, their possessions, and sometimes their entire lives as they knew them. If you're currently living in an apartment and feeling that inexplicable sense of unease, that feeling you're not alone even when you should be, or that primitive instinct telling you something isn't right about your home, trust your instincts. Hit that subscribe button if these stories have opened your eyes to dangers you never considered. And remember that sometimes the most dangerous discoveries are the ones we make about the spaces we live in every day. Drop a comment below if you've experienced anything that made you question the safety of your living space, because sharing our experiences might be the only thing standing between other residents and forces that exist beyond our normal understanding of reality. The next time you hear strange sounds through your walls or notice something odd about your building's atmosphere, remember these stories and understand that home isn't always a place of safety and comfort. Before you go, check out the playlist in the description for more true apartment horror stories that will change how you see communal living forever. Because in the end, The most terrifying realization isn't that these things happened, it's that they're still happening right now. In apartment complexes across the country, to residents who have no idea what they're really sharing space with when they sign their lease. Sweet dreams. And remember, the next time you're lying in bed listening to sounds from the apartment next door, ask yourself if you're really hearing your neighbors, or if you're hearing something that's been living in the building much longer than any lease agreement could account for. Because sometimes the most dangerous residents are the ones who never signed a lease and never plan to leave.